Welcome to the AFGHANEYE YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the AFGHANEYE podcast. I'm your host, Sangar Paikar.
I'm ahmed-waleed.
For the guys who are joining us in, we are going to do a very elaborate discussion on Dr. Najibullah. This is going to be a extended version of the whole conversation, not like what we had intended, but we're really going to delve into history of Dr. Najibullah. And my dear friend Ahmed-waleed has done his research, and we are the audio works for once. Yes. Okay, excellent. So before we start our conversation, I just wanted to say, Ahmed-waleed Kakar, Dr. Najibullah, the topic of our podcast is a very controversial figure. There are people who revere him, and they almost elevated him to some sort of a deity. But there are people who actually really hate him and despise him. So he is a very controversial figure, and we are here not to tell you that either one or the other group is right or wrong. We will present you with as much detail that we have, different perspectives on Dr. Najibullah, and it's up to you, our audience, to make up your mind. So we would like to see comments. We would like to see response from you guys after we discuss everything. We would like to hear from you. What do you think about Dr. Najibullah? Is he, in your opinion, a saintly figure who could predict the future, as some claim, or he was just an evil communist tyrant? Whatever your views and opinions are, we would like to see you, all of them, in the comment section on our YouTube channel. Alternatively, you can respond on Twitter or Instagram. So without out of the way, Ahmed-waleed Kakar, first of all, I would like to ask you, when did you get to know the person Dr. Najibullah for the first time? When did you hear about him for the first time in your life?
I would say around the ages during my teenage years. And I found it really confusing because I would hear, like you mentioned, that from some people that he was an evil, brutal, murderous tyrant. And from other people, I would hear that he was the last true leader that Afghanistan had, the last leader that understood Afghanistan, that understood sort of the political geography, the different sort of peoples comprising Afghanistan, that had sort of the sort of eloquence and that sort of thing. So it was I would say around my teenage years, I started to find out about him. Initially, I was more exposed to people like Hamid Karzai and Rabbani and Sayaf and Hekmatyar and Masood and etc. I found out about Najib relatively later.
Yeah, in my case, I got to learn about Dr. Najibullah very early because he was my father's employer. So I went to school where his wife was the principal and his daughters used to go to the same school, and his brother Ahmad Zai, his wife, was my class tutor. So yeah, totally different. But yeah, so we're going to talk about everything today. So guys, be prepared.
And just before we get into it, I'm aware that this is a live stream, but we're doing this live stream in a sort of a podcasting sort of format. Okay, so whilst we're going to be reading your comments, we're going to come back to the questions right at the end. And of course, super chats will be prioritized in answering those questions. So we're aware that this is a live stream, but for those that are watching live, this is basically what a podcast between Sangar and myself is sort of recorded like. And before we get really deep into it, I'm going to ask everyone to like the video and to share it on their different social media platforms so that other people can find out as well. We've done our bit in sharing it, and because this is a group effort, we would appreciate it if you guys shared it as well. But in any case, without any further ado, Sangar, so I think the main idea behind this podcast or this live stream was the fact that I was actually with you in the Netherlands when it was his death anniversary on the 27th of September 1996. Do you remember that?
Exactly, yes. And I actually remember the year when Najib was killed. I was a teenager and we heard the news and everything. So, yeah, it's something that I can recall every year. It is discussed, and when you were here, we sort of briefly talked about it, and we even decided to do this because we've done a podcast on Daoud Khan, on Amanullah Khan. You've wrote an extensive article about Ahmad Shah Massoud. So we're going to do Dr. Najib, Musa Shafiq, many other interesting figures, Babrak Karmal, maybe Hafizullah Amin, who knows?
Who knows?
I want to start by asking you a very important question. So, you have been doing your research about Dr. Najibullah. Before we talk about his political career, his presidency, or however you would like to call that, can you please tell us something about his family background?
Sure. And I think it's a really good question because whether or not we agree with people we like or we dislike them, I think everybody has a right to sort of be situated amongst their sort of political environment and for us to know who they are and the environment from which they came. So, Dr. Najib, his full name, as we know, was Muhammad Najibullah Ahmadzai, which obviously indicates that he is of the or he was of the Ahmadzai tribe. Now, the Ahmadzai tribe, they inhabit quite a few different provinces in Afghanistan, primarily sort of in the southeast and the east of the country. They have sub tribes as well, but generally they're sort of located in Logar, in Paktia, in Khost. When I say Khost, I'm referring to Jabar Khel in Khost, in Kabul, Laghman, Nangarhar, in and around Hisarak, and obviously there are Jabar Khel in Nangarhar as well, and there are even Babakar Khel in Kunar. So those are all different Ahmadzai clans or sub-clans. Now Najib was from the province that we know as Paktia, and in Paktia he was from an area called Sayed Karam, which is not too far from the provincial capital, Gardez. And Gardez is the one of the largest cities in southeastern Afghanistan. Khost is the largest in the southeast, and Gardez follows straight afterwards. So Najib came from a family. His father was a man called Akhtar Muhammad Khan. Akhtar Muhammad Khan essentially served as a trade attaché for the Afghan government or the royal Afghan government in what is today Pakistan in Peshawar. And so Akhtar Muhammad Khan had good relations, and by extension, Najib had good relations with the tribes that now are in Pakistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And the father of Akhtar Muhammad Khan was actually a tribal Khan called Jahandad Khan. Now, Jahandad Khan was a tribal leader and sort of a Khan or a Malik in that sort of sense, who was a veteran of the Third Anglo-Afghan War. So he fought under the command of General Nadir Khan in the Khost sort of front of that war, and essentially he was, he was decorated as a veteran within that war. After Amanullah Khan was overthrown by Habibullah Kalakani, we know that Kalakani lasted as king of Afghanistan or Amir of Afghanistan for about 9 months. And Nadir Khan came back via India, via Waziristan, up from Paktia and took Kabul. And Jahandad Khan, who is Najib's grandfather, took part in Nadir Khan's campaign. He was a warrior for Nadir Khan's battalion. But later, Jahandad Khan was killed. And what Najib's relatives have told me is that he was killed as part of sort of a organized political conspiracy. And that sort of thing happens. But essentially, Najib's family were involved in the Third Anglo-Afghan War, the war for Afghan independence, and they were involved in bringing Nadir Khan to the throne against uh, Habibullah Kalakani. Now, what's interesting is that another person who was a very famous, decorated war hero of Nadir Khan's war was a man called Abdul Ghani Khan. And Abdul Ghani Khan was also an Ahmed-Zay Sangar. And can you take a guess as to whose grandfather he was?
Uh, I would say Muhammad Ashraf Ghani, Ahmad Zai's grandfather.
Exactly, exactly. So Ashraf Ghani's grandfather and Najibullah's grandfather basically fought on the same side. Now, while just a very quick point here, the war of 1929 or 1930, the civil war between Nadir and Kalakani is characterized as an ethnic war, but in Paktia, there was a bit of a division of loyalties. The Suleiman Khil and the Ahmad Zay, who belonged to the same tribal branch, by the way, fought against each other. The Suleiman Khil were very sort of strong warriors in favor of Kalakani. But essentially, Najib's family were, or his ancestry, were in favor of Nadir Khan. And they basically had nomadic sort of ancestry that had settled around the Paktia area during the reign of Amir Abdurrahman Khan. Perhaps one day we'll cover the reign of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, but in detail, that will be controversial as well. He is also a very controversial, polarizing character. But Amir Abdurrahman Khan fought dozens of rebellions by Ghilji tribes. And I remember you mentioned as well, Sangar, that members of your own tribe had their skulls lined up in what are called kalaminar, or skull towers. But in any case, that is
With regards
essentially.
to Dr. Najib being from a Kuchi tribe,
Mhm.
a short, small anecdote. When he was the president in Afghanistan, his chief of staff was uh, Ishaq Touhi, someone who I've spoken to quite often about Najib. And he said that some of the cousins of Dr. Najib were arrested because they were smuggling and selling guns. Okay?
Okay.
And this is during the time where Najib's government was actively in war against all these Mujahideen factions. And his cousins, they would just sell guns to anyone who was prepared to buy them. And these cousins were Kuchis, and Kuchis, they are people who
They're
are,
entrepreneurial people.
yes. So, Akhtar Mohammad Khan came to the office of Najib and he was very angry. And he said, release my cousins, release my nephews. And the chief of staff of Najib said, what's going on? What's this ruckus? And he said, yes, tell Najib I'm here to see him. I want to see my son. Our nephews, our cousins are arrested. And he said, why? What's happened? And they then when they did some inquiry, they found out that his cousins, the Kuchi guys, they were just selling guns to anyone, even the Mujahideen factions.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's not too different from what happened in the most recent war we had,
yes.
where pro-government sort of personnel were selling food. But Coaches are maligned a lot, and that's one thing that I found interesting, especially because they're sort of portrayed to be barbaric, scary criminals, but really and truly, they're some of the most desperate people in Afghanistan. But in any case, one day, perhaps, inshallah, we'll go into the reign of Amir Abdurrahman in detail, where we'll talk about his. The rebellions with which he was confronted by Khilji tribes, including the Ahmadzai, over things like conscription, taxation, and so on and so forth. Now, that's basically Najib's family background. So we go to his early life, essentially. So Najib was born in around August 1947 in Kabul, in an area of Kabul called Murad Khana, and his family lived in Karte Char. Now, like I said, or Karte Char, kind of like the fourth district, right, Sangar?
Uh, don't ask me about police districts in Kabul. I don't even know
Ka-
exactly if I am from 17th, 18th, or 19th because those districts don't make much sense to me.
No, there's the Hausa, there's the
Yeah.
police house, that's the police, and then there's Karta. And I believe Karta is kind
Ah,
of what we would call in Kandahar Nahiya, which is like a
no, no, no.
residential.
Yes, Karta has nothing to do with Hausa. You're right,
Yeah,
but Karte say, Karte Char, Karte
yeah.
Parwan. Basically, it means areas of the city. Don't ask me why they called it that way, but I think Najib was born in Murad Khani.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
he was born in Murad Khani of Kabul, lived in Karte Char, and now we're talking about his early life, his education, and what radicalized him to become a communist. And I'm being very deliberate with the word here. It's quite a radical thing in Afghanistan to become a communist, which is why at the height of sort of communism in Afghanistan, it only represented about less than 5% of the population. But in any case, Najib studied in Lycée Habibia, which is like a school that was set up by Amir Habibullah Khan, the father of Amanullah, passed his exams, and he went on to study medicine in Kabul University. Now, whilst being a medical student, Najib was imprisoned. I spoke to some of his relatives who said that he was imprisoned for a year. Barnett Rubin actually says in his book that it took Najib 10 years to complete his medical degree because
that's
he
true.
spent a lot of because he spent a lot of time in and out of prison. Now, here's the question. What was a medical student doing in prison? Well, Najib actually joined the Communist Party. And now, like I said, what radicalized a young man? And by the way, his father, Akhtar Mahmad Khan, was known to be a very, very religious person, which is something you'll find that's interesting with a lot of these communists. Suleiman Laiq's father was a staunch not just a religious man, but a Naqshbandi kind of tribal elder. That's why Suleiman Laik's brother-in-law was Sibghatullah Mujaddidi. But in any case, so Najib's joined the Communist Party. Now, we've spoken about the decade of democracy or the constitutional era under Allah's Hazrat Zahir Shah between 1963 and 1973. We covered it in our Dawood Khan podcast. And now, whilst that era had its positives, we also shouldn't be nostalgic or let sort of nostalgia blind us to the very real problems that existed in Afghanistan at the time, which is why you had people that were radical in their outlooks, including people like Najib, including Hafizullah Amin, Nur Muhammad Tarake, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, so on and so forth. So first of all, there was the Cold War going on. Afghanistan at the time, or this very small microcosm of Afghan society at the time, who were educated, who had access to material, news, newspapers, so on and so forth, were seeing that decolonization across the world was very much picking up pace throughout the 50s and the 60s. And they saw a lot of communist or socialist movements basically spearheading a lot of these decolonization movements. So that was one thing that they saw. And they saw an imperfect world in which the imperial powers, which included Britain, which had invaded Afghanistan before, were being predatory, were being unfair in how they approached geopolitics. And as such, they grew closer to, let's say, the Soviet way of thinking or the communist way of thinking of justice, fairness, equality. Secondly, within Afghanistan at the time, Afghanistan was a very unequal society. The king and the elite of Kabuli society which to a large extent these people were from, were very rich, whilst, in the countryside, things like nomadism still existed. And for people, as people like Gulbuddin, people like Rabani, as well as people like Najib, this was unacceptable. There was mass poverty. We spoke about droughts that occurred about during 1969 to 1970. The government's response to those droughts, sorry, to that famine rather, the government's response to the famine was, it was incompetent. The decade of democracy, as it were, was sort of seen as having failed. There were about 4 to 5 prime ministers in one decade. There were workers' strikes. Unions were going on strike. There was,
Just a quick side note. Uh, Dr. Najib was born in Kabul, in Muradkhani, because his father owned a house in Kabul, and owning property in Kabul from someone from Paktia who had a very insignificant job as a clerk in government, it means that they were pretty well off compared to other people in Afghanistan. So you see, Dr. Najib actually represents exactly what you describe. These young men who are very politically aware, and they were convinced that they need to act in order to achieve social justice in the society. They were part of the elite. They were part of the people who were well
exactly.
off.
Exactly. Even I think Lenin, Lenin himself, the man himself, did not come from a poor family. He came
Karl
from the
Marx
elite.
came from a very
Exactly. So this is a trend that you see repeating itself across Afghanistan. Like I said, Suleiman Laiq, who was, let's say, the second most important ideologue for the Afghan Communist Party, was the son of a very famous, decorated Pashtun tribal elder Naqshbandi. And this Suleiman Laiq's father was actually punished by the Afghan government for basically partaking in raids against British forces against the Durand Line. So these people did not sort of come from the lower classes of society. We could say actually that in terms of the communist movement in Afghanistan, the Maoists, the Sholais, were drawn from generally more the lower class of society. People like Najib, Laiq, so on and so forth, came from the higher brass. But so in any case, and there's another factor as well here, Sangar. There is the discontent with religion, or how religion was practiced in Afghanistan, how the traditional clergy, the ulama, how they interacted with the state and vice versa. There was a feeling that religion was actually holding Afghanistan back, and that religion itself was being instrumentalized in an alliance with a feudalistic government in order to basically oppress and crush the peasants and the nomads. And
you know why? Because my father was just like Najib. He was the son of a tribal figure who was the Malik in
Ahmadzai.
yeah, he was the Malik of our district in a region, a very prominent figure. They owned land, and these men, they sent their sons to the city to study, and when they would study, well, Afghanistan was part of the sphere of influence of Soviet Union, in the sense that there was a lot of communist literature translated in Farsi, either by the Iranians or by Soviet agents in Afghanistan, and they were distributing a lot of communist literature, all this anti-imperialist ideas about the whole concept that religion is somehow holding people back, the opium of the masses. All these matters, they originate from Soviet propaganda, Soviet literature that was distributed in schools. Just like Najib went to school in Kabul, so did my father. And in school, teenage boys, they would get these small pamphlets and booklets and etc. that would tell them about all these social and political matters. And those matters have influenced these young men and made them believe that somehow all the ills and all the problems of society are caused by uh, feudalism and religion,
But
etc.
I think it's important to note, however, that they weren't entirely unjustified in how they saw the religious and the monarchical establishment interacting with one another. For example, you had the Gilani family, you had the Hazrats of Shor Bazar. I mentioned, I think, in the previous live stream that after Zahir Shah's father or Nadir Shah took the throne, basically the Hazrats of Shor Bazar were given almost a monopoly in terms of their control over the judicial establishment. So it's not entirely without reason that they sort of thought that the religious establishment, as they saw it in Afghanistan, was holding the country back. Now, obviously, because communism itself was an anti religious or is an anti religious ideology, they didn't really frame themselves as being anti religious to begin with, and rather, the hadith of the Prophet والسلام, of pay the laborer his wages before the sweat dries from his brow. That was, things like that were basically extrapolated to basically justify communism to the masses and say, look, we are the real Muslims. We are the ones that want to give women their rightful place in society. We want to uplift the peasants and the nomads. We want a fair society. Doesn't Islam preach fairness? Doesn't Islam talk against israf or extravagance? That's one thing that has to be noted, that this wasn't articulated, overtly in hostility toward religion. But these are the factors we could say. There's a guy that's in the live chat that's basically accusing us of being biased against Dr. Najib and saying that we bought British books to study Dr. Najib. But so far, we're just, that may be his perspective. But so far, we're just trying to understand what leads the son of a religious man or the grandson of a tribal elder in Afghanistan to become a communist, right? And so Dr. Najib was essentially recruited to the Afghan Communist Party by Suleiman Laik. Now, Suleiman Laik, I believe, was from Paktika, right? Also,
Technically, yes, but more
back
from
then it was all
Baghlan.
Paktia.
No, Baghlan.
So, so
His father was the
was
Khalifa of.
deported.
No, his father was the Khalifa of the Pir of their tariqa in Baghlan.
I see. So the interesting thing is that Suleiman Laik's father was actually deported to Baghlan from Paktika, and he was deported because he was causing trouble along the Durand line. So, so essentially, Suleiman Laik was basically the one to recruit Najib to the Afghan Communist Party, and Najib himself joined the Parchamis. And he joined the Parchamis, and he was especially inspired by a man called Mir Akbar Khairbar, whose assassination actually triggered the communist coup d'etat of 1978. Now, Mir Akbar Khairbar was, we could say, Afghanistan's true Marxist ideologue. He didn't believe in taking power by force. He actually believed that Afghanistan was ill prepared for a communist revolution. So he thought that the best path was, this is a decades long project. We need to educate and enlighten the masses. And
Yes,
we can't really,
I think we have already mentioned this before, but in Marxism, there are different madhahib, there are different schools of thought. So the most conservative orthodox Marxists, they don't believe in Leninism. They don't believe that a non-industrialized society, you know, can just have a communist revolution. So what Walid, what you were referring to is basically Mir Akbar Khaybar was saying that yes, we believe in Marxism, yes, we believe in social justice and dialectic materialism, etc., but we don't believe that Afghanistan is ready for that. Others disagreed.
exactly. So that's essential. Obviously, others include the Khalqis of people like Nur Muhammad Tarake of Hafizullah Amin, and so on and so forth. But Najib himself was Parchami. And There's another factor in his radicalization as well. We could say, I guess, a feeling of sort of coming from a tribal background, of being repressed by a Muhammad dynasty or monarchy, of his grandfather being killed in an organized conspiracy surrounding the king. Those sorts of things are, they're important factors in his radicalization.
But
Now, what I have
but
here,
just one
okay.
second. So the idea that he was radicalized because the Mohammedzai were ruling the country and he was a Ghaljay, I'm not really sure if that, what is this based on?
Speaking to his family, apparently he's been quoted as saying that these people, referring to the king, stood on our shoulders to become kings.
Hmm. So
Right?
he was a tribal, you know what?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's that people are products of their environment. There's, we could say, sort of a tribal aspect to resentment toward the central government in Kabul. There's the ideological aspect of the Cold War going on, of socialism versus capitalism. There's the failures of the political system in Afghanistan at the time. And whilst, we've discussed those, if the political system in Afghanistan were sufficient, we wouldn't have had a communist revolution breaking out. But in any case, what I've got here is a book, Night Letters by Chris Sands and Fazl Minallah Qazizeh, right? And for those who've been
A
with us from
previous
the very
guest of the AFGHANEYE podcast.
the second guest, I believe it was the second or the third
Yes,
guest that we had on the
yes.
AFGHANEYE podcast. We actually interviewed and we reviewed the book Night Letters. And by the way, for everyone, if you haven't read this book, I don't know what you're doing. I actually refuse to talk to you if you haven't read this book. But in any case, this is something else I find. This is an excerpt from the book, by the way. So, as I'm going to read here, right? During one student debate, the Hizb Amir, or Gulbuddin, recalled telling Najib that Afghanistan risked becoming another Soviet satellite state like the Central Asian republics. Najib had simply replied, "That's okay. The Central Asian countries are in a much better condition than us." Right? So, what you see here is that Najib's perspective of what is better and what is worse is probably based on materialism or dialectic materialism. The fact that the Soviet Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union had been repressed, languages, cultures, Islam had been repressed, that obviously didn't really matter to Najib because he saw that they were more materially advanced. And as such, they were in a better position than Afghanistan was. So that is essentially the background to Najib's early life, his education, his radicalization. We obviously could go into much more detail, right? But I think that is enough of a background for the time being. Now, let's get started on his political career, okay? So, Sangar, the Saud Revolution happened on the 27th to the 28th of April, 1978, where forces led by Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Tarake essentially killed. Excuse me, give me a second. So Khalqi forces, so the Khalqi branch of the Communist Party, essentially launched a coup d'etat against Sardar Mohammad Dawood Khan. Sorry, my mistake. So they launched a coup d'etat against Sardar Mohammad Dawood Khan and essentially proclaimed the beginning of what was a socialist revolution. Now, if we know about the Afghan Communist Party, we know that they were split along the Khalqi and the Parchami lines, as in Leninist and more classical sort of.
Actually,
We need.
uh, I've had a lot of conversations prior to this podcast to really try to understand this, but you know, it appears that that's not exactly correct. Okay,
Okay.
so the Khalqis and Parchamis were not merely divided by ideology; they were also more so divided based on cult of personality. So you had the cult of personality of Babra Karmal, who had his fanboys, and people were almost worshipping him as an ideologue, as a guy who was very eloquent in his speeches. And on the other hand, you had
I beg to differ.
okay,
Honestly, those speeches were not good, man.
okay, that's your opinion. That's my opinion. We don't like him, but people at that time, there a lot of young men, they weren't necessarily convinced by any ideological arguments. They just happen to prefer a urbanite, sophisticated guy who uses a lot of fancy words like Babrak Karmal, and others they liked the rural Nur Muhammad Tarake, who is slightly less sophisticated villager type intellectual, and honestly. This is a very important aspect of the division within the Hizb Democratic Khalq Afghanistan. We often try to rationalize these differences by thinking that some of them were more inclined towards Leninism and others weren't. That's not entirely true, because even among many Parchamis, there were people who believed, let's just grab the power and just kill people, and then it's not as
But is it not true that Mir Akbar Khaybar was an ideologue that was generally followed more by Parchamis, and as a result, they were less inclined toward taking power militarily the way that Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Tarake were? Is that not an
you
accurate assessment in your view?
that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I
Mhm.
agree that makes a lot of sense. But then there is also this conspiracy theory that Babrak Karmal was involved in assassinating Mir Akbar Khaybar. Okay, so that makes
Yes.
things even more complicated. So
Engineer Saib Hekmatyar is also taking credit for it.
yeah, 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 I know, but there are when we reach the fall of Najib, we will talk about this more. But
Mhm.
there are theories that actually the Russians, via their proxies, were involved in taking out Mir Akbar Khaybar. But we'll talk about this later on.
Okay, no worries. But essentially, so the communist coup d'etat happens. Dawood or I'm respectful, right? I'm gonna be like Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan was killed with something like 17, 18 members of his family. And essentially, what you have is sort of a radical system or radical plan of action is drawn up by the Khalqi leadership headed by Nur Muhammad Tarake, right? Now, the Khalqis start fighting amongst each other eventually, which ends up with Nur Muhammad Tarake being suffocated to death in the presidential palace by Hafizullah Amin's men. However, before that, there's actually something of a purge of Parchami members of the Communist Party. Now, the classic way in which Parchami members are exiled is actually by being sent abroad as ambassadors. And that is where Dr. Najib comes in. Najib is sent as ambassador to Iran, right? But then, following that, he's actually accused of partaking in a conspiracy to overthrow the government or the Khalqi government, and he actually goes into exile in Bulgaria, right? And I also heard that he went to Germany and
Yes. So there
he's
is there is this guy in Germany. He was studying in Germany. His name is Daoud something, but
Mhm.
he claims that Najib stayed at his apartment while he was studying in Germany. For a while, Najib was staying with him. Um, yeah, and something else that is important about the whole Khalqi infighting. Basically, while Karmal was in Moscow, in Bulgaria, and then later on in Moscow, um, during Amin's no, during Nur Muhammad Tarake's time, the Russians were very concerned. Okay, they were very concerned because while they did like to see a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan, they were scared that these guys are too radical and too fanatic, which might trigger a mass rebellion against them. and that's something that like these concerns were present among Soviets. So
Exactly.
yes.
100%. But by the way, guys, we could sort of dissect this live stream or this podcast. We could talk for 5, 6 hours, right, and go really into depth. But that's obviously not the aim here. So we're kind of skipping over uh, you know, skipping over certain dates and so on and arriving at the main sort of points of history which we would like to cover. So, like I said, Najib was appointed as the Afghan ambassador to Iran, then exiled in Bulgaria and in Germany. But then what happened on the 24th or the 29th of December 1979 is that Afghanistan is actually invaded by the Soviet Union by what was called a limited contingent of troops. And that limited contingent went into the presidential palace, killed Hafizullah Amin. It wasn't a limited contingent, by the way. It ended up being something like 100 and something thousand soldiers. But Hafizullah Amin was killed, and Babrak Karmal, who was basically by that point an asylum seeker in the Soviet Union, was placed in charge of the government. Now, if you know communism, you know that they don't really like the word president or prime minister. They're always sort of the general secretary of the Communist Party and the chairman of the Revolutionary Council. But essentially, for all intents and purposes, the head of state was appointed. Babrak Karmal was appointed as the head of state. Now, a brief background on Babrak Karmal is that he was elected to the Afghan parliament as an MP in 1965. He actually was hospitalized after getting into a physical altercation with Maulawi Muhammad Nabi Muhammadi, who was another Ahmadzai, by the way, but he was a mullah who ended up founding his own Mujahideen party. And he was a long time, Babrak Karmal was a long time Marxist. He was probably, I believe, of Kashmiri descent. However, he claimed to be Pashtun in order to gain further credibility. And he was a notorious womanizer and alcoholic. And that's not British imperialist propaganda. You can speak to Communist Party officials and they'll basically agree that that was the case. But essentially, Babrak Karmal was the president of Afghanistan, or a Soviet occupied Afghanistan, from 1980 to 1986. During that time, Najib.
You need to pause here because there's
Mhm.
something important that we have to uh, explain. While Babra Karmal was in exile, basically he's used all his time in exile to tell the Soviet leaders, you need to get rid of Hafizullah Amin because Hafizullah Amin studied in United States. He is CIA, and he might try to basically surrender Afghanistan to the imperialist, capitalist forces, unite with Pakistan and the Americans. And basically, he lobbied in Moscow and convinced the Soviets that they have to invade, that they have to overthrow these guys. And he was very influential because the Soviets believed everything he said because he was fluent in Russian. And that's a major aspect of the whole decision making surrounding Afghanistan. So when Karmal became president or he took over, it was due to his own political activities. You know, the Soviets were actually convinced that this man knows what he's talking about. That's why they put him in charge.
You know, there's a theory that the reason Hafizullah Amin was radicalized in the U.S. and his antipathy toward the United States was grounded in the fact that he failed an exam there or something. But yeah, in any case, so thank you for that background, Sangar. So essentially,
And
in
the reason
19,
why I mentioned this because
Mhm.
we are talking about Najib, and Najib was a
a
guy who
follower of
was
Karmal.
he was totally convinced in his early ages that Karmal is his peer, you know, his spiritual guide, and that's why it's very important to bear this in mind when we talk about later stages of Najib's life. and his downfall, because in his early life, as a young man, as a follower, as a devotee of Barak Karmal, he basically agreed with everything that Karmal stood for. He fought people who were.
On the streets.
He even almost got into a fist fight with my father because my father was bad mouthing Babrak Karmal. So that's the personality of Najib. He initially, as a young man, while he was a student, he saw Karmal as the leader of the party, the guy who knows what to do. So when Karmal became president, thanks to the Russians, obviously that was a turning point for Najib intellectually, ideologically, and he became a mature man. He wasn't no longer just a student.
Exactly. So, what happened, Sankar, when Karmal was made president, right? What position was Najib given?
Um, Head of the security, so
Head of the secret police.
secret
So,
police.
guys, we're getting into his Dr. Najib's political career here now. Okay, so the first major post that he holds, I mean, we could say the second after being the ambassador to Iran, but the first major post that he holds is being the director general of the secret police. Now, the secret police were called Khad. Khad standing for خدمات اطلاعات دولتي, which is basically so service of information, uh, state information service. Okay,
Yes,
now
the name is basically a variation of Комитет государственной безопасности, which is Committee of Government Security, the name of KGB, and they made
exactly.
a variation, an Afghan variation of the same thing.
Exactly. And it's actually important to note that Khat was essentially the Afghan equivalent of the KGB. So Khat was created in response to the prevailing circumstances in 1980, which was a dire lack of information as to the insurgency with which the communist puppet government in Kabul and the Russians were confronted with. Above all, as I said, خدمات إطلاعات دولتي, there was no إطلاعات, there was no information as to what was actually happening, right? So this is the reason for which Khat was actually created, and Najib was seen as charismatic, as committed, as energetic, as dynamic, someone who could lead the state security apparatus. Okay,
He
now
was also a
as
big guy who could beat up people. He
exactly,
was
and
intimidating.
exactly. He was actually his nickname during his student days was Najib Gal or Najib the Bull, and that was because he used to get into fist fights with other students of different political persuasions on student campuses and in the streets, and so on and so forth. So Khad essentially grew to be the most and this isn't a big statement considering how dysfunctional the puppet communist government was, but Khad itself was something like a ministry within a ministry. It was almost like a state within a state. It was the most effective, the most organized, and the most disciplined government body that existed. By 1990, according to some reports, 150,000 Afghans had actually been arrested by Khad. Now, as time went on, Khad became more and more professional, and its methods of information gathering and interrogation were standardized and became more, let's say, humane, less reliant on torture. But the reason that torture existed, like I said, was in order to extract information. And now I'm going to read a passage for, actually, you know what? Let me start off with what General Nabi Azimi says. So Nabi Azimi was the deputy defense minister under Najib, and he was the commander of the Kabul garrison, who eventually defected to Ahmad Shah Massoud's camp in and around Jabal Saraj. And he essentially played a massive role in handing over loads of weapons to what was then the Northern Alliance, consisting of General Momin Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Ismaili Pir of Baghlan, and Abdul Rashid Dostum. Now, bear in mind, the quote I'm reading to you is coming from someone who defected from Najib. Okay, he basically betrayed Najib. So there is obviously an implicit understanding here that his assessment is going to be biased, but let's read his assessment nonetheless. So General Nabi Azimi said that Khad under Najib arrested, quote, arrested too many ordinary people, clergymen, intellectuals, and put them in Pulicharchi prison or executed them in Pulicharchi prison without trial on dark nights and threw them into holes already prepared. Now, that is the assessment of someone that was that was a communist, right? He was the communist deputy minister of defense, but he defected from Najib. But now let's read some other excerpts with regard to the sort of thing that Khad did. Okay. Now, once again, I'm reading from Night Letters. Okay. Um, Najib expected the behavior of Khad operatives to reflect the two traits central to his character: acumen and cruelty. Inmates had their nails torn out, their tongues stabbed with pins, their beards set on fire. Some were anally raped using bottles and bullets. Others had weights hung to their testicles or drills inserted into their thigh bones. Whilst all opponents of the communist regime were vulnerable to abuse, Najib and his henchmen delighted in tormenting Hizbis, that is Hizb Islami Gulbuddin. In one typical, so his younger brother had once been stabbed and injured in a skirmish with the Muslim youth, and throughout the 1980s, Najib exacted revenge on his siblings' behalf with undisguised glee. In one instance, a disciple of Hikmatyar was arrested and taken to Khad Sidarat compound in the heart of Kabul when Najib punched him in the face, knocking out two of his teeth. "I was looking for you in the sky, but found you on the earth," he told the prisoner, ridiculing his belief in God. So after that, the story goes that Najib's subordinates spent the next month and a half torturing the Hizbi. They got drunk and tortured him to the love songs of Ahmad Zair. Okay. Another part of this testimony says that at one point, the Hizbi was tied to the ceiling of his cell, leaving him hanging in excruciating pain, while the door was left open in front of him so he could see three female prisoners, two girls and a woman, being sexually assaulted in a nearby room. His torturer warned him that his family would meet the same fate if he did not reveal more information about Hizb Islami.
And this is Najib doing this.
The, so Najib punched the guy's teeth, punched out the guy's teeth, and essentially mocked him, saying, "You know, I was looking for you in the skies and I found you on Earth. Essentially, you know, you pray to the skies, sort of thing, and I found you on Earth." And then his subordinates essentially took over from there, torturing him, forcing him to watch women being raped and threatening him, and so on and so forth. Now, that is essentially the role that Dr. Najib played in within his capacity as Director General of Khad. Now,
You know, the thing with torture and rape and all these very brutal tactics that were recorded during the communist regime, what's important is that before the communists took over, even before Dawood uh, overthrew the monarchy, the state had its intelligence services in Afghanistan, and that
mhm.
intelligence service was always doing this kind of stuff,
Yeah,
torturing
we spoke
people.
about Maywandwal, the former prime minister, dying under Dawood. But what's interesting, Sangar, is that the people that were interrogating Maywandwal
Yes,
were Parchamis.
exactly. So what happened is that basically this practice of having a very brutal and very violent organization that is entirely dedicated at arresting and forcing, political opposition of the state to either give up information, or what happened especially in the first couple of months of the Khalqi era. They basically killed thousands of people, like 30, 40,000 people died in the first few months So when finally the Parchami faction under Karmal took over and Najib became the head of the state intelligence agency, uh, the same or kind of uh, brutality was carried out under the same government. And what's interesting is that we see now all these books, all these different reports, and all these different testimonies of people who are saying that these are the brutal acts of this regime. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are denying that. Like, for instance,
If they're denying it, sorry, if they're denying it, I just read an excerpt from Night Letters, right,
yeah,
which is essentially, we could say, a biography, a political biography of Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. But now let me also read an excerpt from the Afghanistan Justice Project by the Open Society Foundation. Right now, here's the thing: it's that these are testimonies.
yes,
Okay, so when the testimonies start to corroborate one another,
yeah.
then things start to become more problematic. Okay.
Exactly, this is the point. So my father worked for this organization, worked for Najib. So when we talk about these matters, there are a lot of people who will become very defensive, and they say, "How could you say that Najib was so great?" And how could you? Well, the truth is that if these things would have never happened, we wouldn't have so many corroborating statements from so many different people. It's not just propaganda. Like, even if we compare that to the current situation, we know that the NDS has done terrible things, torturing people, killing people, and there are so many different people who testify that these things have happened.
Mhm.
It's not something that is being just fabricated. Yes, please read from the Afghanistan Justice
So,
Project.
I mentioned the Mujaddidis and the Gilanis before. So here's another testimony. Now, this one is actually coming from a former officer. Okay. This is coming from a former officer of Khat, and he's obviously chosen to disguise his name. He's called himself Witness A. But he says the house of Pir Gilani, which had been captured by the government, was the interrogation place. It's in Bagh in Naqib, next to the Indian embassy. It was the military intelligence center. Hamid al-Shamal carried out the torture. Hisamuddin and Habibullah, his deputies, were both present. Now, they tortured people by beating them with a special piece of wood on the legs and feet, and they took out their fingernails with pliers, and by putting bottles into the anus. They kept the prisoners awake. The 105 administration technical section was brought in. Uh, they had special torture instruments from Russia, for example, caps which gave electric shocks to the head, and something similar which gave shocks to the fingers and the genitals. The head of this unit was so and so. I'm not going to mention names there because that's going to open another can of worms. But yeah, um, let me just go on quickly. So yeah, those are essentially the details. So we have fingernails being pointed out, people being raped, having things forcefully inserted into them with certain objects which seem to be
We are
bottles.
going to get demonetized for all of this.
But I think the thing is that I think it's important, just people are watching. These are the sorts of things that happened under Khad. Now, once again, why was Khad doing this? Because it saw that this was its best way of collecting information through a sheer police state, through sheer terror and inflicting pain. Now, as time went on, the organization became increasingly more professionalized. Torture did diminish in its usage, but it was never truly eliminated. But that essentially is how we can characterize the role of Najib as head of Khad. It's actually interesting because my father's friend fell on the battlefield in the early 1980s in Afghanistan. And something like the story goes that a Khad pickup truck basically took him, and my father's friend was never seen again. And that, I think that was my father's one of his closest friends growing up. They came from the same area in Kabul, and they were also from the same tribe as us as well. But it's not just, active mujahideen on the front lines and so on and so forth. I have dozens of relatives, none of whom I've met, but who will tell you that their relatives basically disappeared in the middle of the night whilst Najib was head of Khad. People were basically taken in the middle of the night and were never seen again. And to this day in Afghanistan, we still have mass graves that are discovered both from the Taraki Amin era and from the Najib era as head of Khad. But now in 1986, um, that is essentially the picture of Najib as head of Khad. Do you have anything to add
Yes,
to that,
so
Sangar?
when he was head of Khat, um, the Soviets really trusted him. Okay,
Hmm.
they really believe that this man knows a lot because he's the head of intelligence. He has created a very efficient institution that gathers intelligence. So Yuri Andropov, who was the head of KGB in 1982, he basically wanted to know what's going on because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and suddenly you see people all across the country joining the resistance against the Soviets. And Babra Karmal, I hinted at this earlier. Babra Karmal, during his exile, he tried to convince the Soviets that, everything is going to be fine if we just help me take over the country. Most people support us. People love us.
He
We are
also
with the
declared a
people.
jihad. He declared a jihad against the Mujahideen as well.
Yes, yes, just like the Karzai and Ghani regime, their government, their mullahs, they would say that Taliban are this and that. There was even an American general a few years ago. He said that they're the real Mujahideen, So what's interesting is that Yuri Andropov, he was wondering why is it that there are so many people who are opposed to this government and the Russians, their Soviet troops. So obviously, when they would talk to Babra Karmal, by that time, the Soviets realized that he was severely addicted to alcohol and he was not capable of leading. He was not capable of actually saying something that made sense to the Soviets. Everybody is very prejudiced about Russians and communists in general, and they believe that they're all alcoholics. But even for Soviet standards, Babra Karmal was considered a very problematic figure because he was drunk all the time. And his opinions about the situation in Afghanistan were not very convincing. So, the Soviets really didn't believe what he was saying anymore. So that's why Yuri Andropov, he spoke to Najibullah. He said, why are these people so opposed to this government and why are they so opposed to us? And Dr. Najib, this is one of the early incidents where the other side of Najib emerged. The other Najib that was not a radical fanatic communist, but someone who sort of changed his views and opinion. So Yuri Andropov asked him, can you explain why people are opposing us? And he said, listen, I am from the Melan Valley of Paktia. When I visited my aunt in Paktia, when I was 12 years old, I wanted to kiss my aunt's hand to greet her, but she wrapped her hand in her scarf before she allowed me to kiss her hand because she said, you're now becoming an adult and it's not appropriate for you to kiss my bare hand. He said, this is how conservative our society is. And in this conservative society, we are going door to door, invading people's houses with Russian soldiers, and this is causing a rebellion. People are opposed to us because we're basically forcing ourselves onto these people. And according to the story that I've heard from many sources, Yuri Andropov said he used some Russian profanity and then said that alcoholic, that womanizer, has been lying to us all the time. This makes much more sense than what we have heard from him. So this is like, even within the Communist Party, this is one of the first moments where there was a clear difference of view and perspective between the ideologue, the spiritual father, Babrak Karmal, and his devotee, Najib. They had two totally divergent views about Soviet occupation and the government, while Najib was the head of Khad. So you see...
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So you see, it's important to know that when we later discuss the Najib's national reconciliation policy, we have to understand in the backdrop, we have to understand that this man went through a transition where he basically realized that nothing made much sense of their government and the Soviet occupation.
Now, see, that's very interesting because obviously I did my due diligence, I did my research, I spoke to a few people, but I wasn't sort of aware of this actually. And it's really important because we're going to get onto the national reconciliation. And if we look at the timeline of the national reconciliation, it comes after a very important meeting between Najib and Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. So you would think that the national reconciliation is motivated only by political expediency, but what you've said here, what you've just told me, essentially disproves that. So that was
I wouldn't say exactly that it disproves it, but it provides some context to how Najib was also a man who was capable of changing his mind and changing his views.
Okay. So that's basically that. So going on from Yuri Andropov calling Babrak Karmal a bloody womanizing alcoholic, and so on and so forth, Gorbachev essentially became the head of the USSR in 1985, and he had two. He basically had two pillars on which he came to power. So, for those who didn't I don't know any Russian, but I know the words because of my GCSE history. It was glasnost and perestroika. And perestroika meant restructuring, and glasnost kind of meant transparency. But in any case, Gorbachev had decided that he wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, and he decided he wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, and that obviously necessitated a change within Afghanistan. Now, Babrak Karmal by this stage had been the head of the state for 6 years, and because he'd been the head of state of 6 years and there hadn't been much meaningful progress, in fact, things had gotten they'd gotten even worse under him, the Kremlin essentially decided that the head of the Afghan state needed to be changed. And that's when Najibullah was brought in. So in order to make this as graceful as possible, Najibullah replaced Karmal as the general secretary of the Communist Party on May the 4th, 1986. And then Karmal remained as chairman of the Revolutionary Council until November 1986. And then he was essentially forced out of that, or he resigned, claiming that he was ill. And Najib was made the head of basically, Najib thereafter became the chairman of the Revolutionary Council and the general secretary of the Communist Party. Now, in December 1986,
what's important is that the Central Committee of the party voted in favor of having Najib as the new leader, but a minority within the Central Committee of the party were in favor of Karmal. So when
we're gonna get onto that. We're gonna get onto
there
that.
were protests. The Parchamis, they were actually protesting in Kabul against Najib.
Well, but in any case, this was a change that was engineered from the top. And when I say the top, I mean the Kremlin. Okay. But now in November, Najib became the head of the chairman of the Revolutionary Council. In December 1986, Najib was called to Moscow, where he met Gorbachev. And this meeting was very important. Gorbachev essentially told him to essentially that a Soviet withdrawal was imminent, that it would, and that Najib should basically emphasize reconciliation, launch a political program to try to reincorporate the Mujahideen into government, and basically to end the war politically, to put in motion the steps that would ensure that. The Soviet Union was leaving. It had tried and it had failed to defeat the Mujahideen. The regime in Afghanistan was too unpopular, and the only way through which it could continue to survive in some way, shape, or form was through a political process. That essentially in 1987 led to the announcement of what was called Musaleh Milli, the national reconciliation that was announced by Najib. So essentially, that meant that that meant that a lawyer jirga was called. There was a new constitution. The flag, I believe, was changed as well. And Najib formally became president. Now, Najib had told his own party that none of the gains of the communist revolution would be lost. However, he basically went about systematically reversing each and every point that the revolution had been launched to achieve. So all of the previous policies on sort of land, all of the things that were sort of extremely anti-Islam or were seen as being against Islam, those were essentially rescinded or replaced. And so that was essentially a way in which Najib tried to basically move toward the political center. On top of that,
Here,
um,
before you
yeah,
go on, here is an interesting detail. So apparently, the the meeting between Gorbachev and Najib, where he basically told him to try to reconcile with his political opposition. Did you know who Gorbachev had in mind? Did he want
Ahmed
him to
Shah Massoud,
Yes. When Najib
not with
became
Hekmatyar.
no, obviously not. But and people who want to know why, I suggest you should read Ahmed-Waleed Kakar's article about Ahmad Shah Massoud, where he explains in detail why the Soviets favored Ahmad Shah Massoud over anybody
We're
else.
gonna we're gonna get onto that, and I've
Yeah,
actually
but
got something very interesting to reveal as well.
yeah, so apparently Gorbachev told Najib that you need to reconcile with these guys. And when Najib became president, Ministry of Defense was vacant for 6 months. Why?
I
Because,
read that it was 2 months.
well, no, it was actually 6 months,
Okay.
according to what I've heard from various sources. But apparently, it was because they were hoping that there would be some kind of reconciliation and Ahmad Shah Massoud would become the Minister of Defense. But it never happened. This never materialized.
It never happens, but so that is an interesting point. So, and this is something that is worthy of mention. The Soviets, and by extension the communists in Kabul, were above all, they were most scared of Hikmatyar and Hizb Islami, not just in terms of the fact that it was the most, let's say, organized, centralized organization that was operating within Afghanistan, but also, in the aftermath of a potential takeover by Hizb Islami that could cause problems for the Soviet Union itself by way of the Central Asian republics. It should also be mentioned that Hizb Islami were also exceedingly brutal in the way they conducted their war. They were through and through almost a Leninist organization in how they were structured, organized, and how they thought. So
Just
Gorbachev,
like the communists had Khat and Dr. Najibullah, Hekmatyar had engineer Muhammad Khan, who basically would assassinate anyone who even looked the wrong way towards.
Yeah, and there are loads of assassinations that are attributed to Hikmatyar, or he's suspected of. But so we come back to the point, and that is that the national reconciliation, however, was opposed by his own camp. Right, the national reconciliation was opposed by people that what's it called? Sorry, excuse me, my mistake. But yeah,
The
so the
Karmalist
national
faction,
so
basically the
the
Karmalist faction, the followers of Babrak Karmal, uh, even some Khalqis, they were opposed to the fact that Najib was trying to reconcile with these savage, barbarian, uh, primitive mujahideen. They didn't
exactly.
want that. They were so convinced that they should preserve the regime at any cost forever and never reconcile with these people. So when Najib announced his reconciliation policy, uh, they were, his own Parchamis from his own faction, his own inner group were opposed to him.
Exactly. So, especially the Karmalis, who were basically loyal to Babrak Karmal, but they'd somewhat lost their power because the Soviet Union essentially backed Najib's political position. It was the political position, of course, that they had recommended. Now, in addition to that, what you saw from Najib is in this time that he started to increasingly rely on militias. So, not his own sort of standing or professional army, but relying on militias. So one of these people that we know now is Abdul Rashid Dostum, who essentially was the head of the Jozjani militia and who was absolutely feared across Afghanistan. Dostum's troops were essentially used as shock troops transported around the country to fight if and where needed. For example, they fought in Kandahar, specifically in Arghandab in 1987, 1988, where they committed widespread atrocities. And this is interesting because Najib is seen as a Pashtun sort of nationalist hero, but from what is said is that the Dostum's troops were especially brutal in and around Kandahar because they saw the local population, Pashtuns, Durrani Pashtuns, as essentially the enemy. So that is one thing but there are also other militia leaders as well. So there was a
Like
guy in
Ismat
Helmand,
Muslim.
Ismat Muslim, I believe that was he tried barging into the National Reconciliation lawyer Jirga. He remained on Najib's side, but there was also Nasim Akhundzada in Helmand,
Yes.
who had become very rich off the opium trade. He was a Mujahideen commander. Think he belonged to Harakat, to Mawla Imam al-Nabi's faction, but Najib essentially bribed him to join the government and have basically his militia to form the government. And
And by the way, this is something that a lot of people are in total denial of. You know, even my father, who is sort of not really um, critical of Najib, in my opinion, not critical enough. He is critical
mhm,
of Najib, but even he is in denial, and many others they deny this. But basically, the most corrupt, most brutal, most evil warlords, commanders all across the country, Najib would make all sorts of deals with them, pay
mhm,
them large sums of money so that they switch to his side. One of those guys was Ismat Muslim from Spin Boldak, who is, again, someone who is mentioned in an article written on the AFGHANEYE website by ahmed-waleed Kakar, and I definitely read that article. But Ismat Muslim detail both of his sons were my classmates in Kabul, and his sons were just like the father. They would just beat up everyone in our school, everyone, and for some reason they
I
wouldn't
hope
beat me
not
up.
you.
No. For some reason
Okay.
they didn't have any beef with me, but everybody else was just target. but
But
this
there's
is
something
this.
that I want to mention here because we're
Yeah.
talking about 1987, 1988. So you mentioned that the Soviets themselves obviously preferred Ahmad Shah Massoud to Hikmatyar, and that's because they saw Ahmad Shah Massoud as someone that they could sort of deal with, that they could understand, a pragmatic politician. And it was also, if you read Roderick Braithwaite's book, who was the former British ambassador to Moscow, he essentially details the negotiations between Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Russians that culminated in that infamous truce between 1983 and 1984. Massoud was very conciliatory. And by the way, I don't say this in an insulting manner, but Massoud was very sort of shrewd politician in that he told the visiting Soviets that, you know, he struck a conciliatory tone, almost like what we hear the Taliban saying today, that all of these Soviet soldiers, they're just conscripts. We don't want to kill them. They've been caught in this useless war. We don't want to kill anyone. We want to have good relations with Russia. Whereas Hekmatyar was obviously more like,
Do or
no,
die.
we are going to take the war all the way to Kazakhstan. Um, there's no compromise, do or death sort of thing. But here's the thing, once again detailed in night letters. So the Russians actually offered to cut a deal with Ahmad Shah Massoud in late 1988. And essentially, they were saying that they were offering Ahmad Shah Massoud this deal with Najib. Okay. And according to night letters, the extraordinary nature of the proposed concessions included the creation of an autonomous Tajik region in Afghanistan that would have its own armed forces. Okay. Massoud stalled on the deal as he weighed up his chances of defeating Hizb in a civil war and gaining control over all of Afghanistan. Okay, so one of the things that Ahmad Shah, if he was lacking something, it wasn't ambition. Because the Russians essentially, I mean, you could use this both ways, right? You could say that if Ahmad Shah Massoud was entirely motivated by ethnicity, he would have taken his deal in 1988, right? But he didn't, right? Which meant that he obviously was fighting for something more. That argument could be made. But on the other hand, you could say if the Russians are willing to offer you that, it probably means they're very vulnerable and you could probably gain a lot more than just an autonomous Tajik region,
But
right?
there is one other important factor. The Soviet Union, uh, they realized that military occupation of Afghanistan is extremely expensive. It
Mhm.
basically was breaking their back financially. They were losing thousands of people, thousands of young men who were fighting all across southern, eastern Afghanistan. And uh, the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapsing. But giving Afghanistan to the Mujahideen who were aligned with the with the Americans was not an option. So the Russians, they couldn't afford having a pro-American regime in Kabul. So the idea of supporting,
Or Hikmatyar.
yes, the idea of supporting Ahmad Shah Massoud wasn't just because they thought, oh, a desperate measure. The idea was to create a situation where there is permanent conflict in the region, civil war and instability in Afghanistan. So if Afghanistan cannot be a satellite state of the Soviets, then it shouldn't fall into anybody else's hand. So if they are in a permanent state of crisis and war, that's preferable for Moscow than anything else. So that's why they try to support all these fringe groups, fringe figures, and this is an important uh, explanation for why even today you see certain things like we will delve into that later on, but there are many parallels between that era and our current situation in Afghanistan. Walid, are you still there?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, Sangat. I think the connection is just thingy. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're breaking up a little bit, but please carry on.
I see. Just give me a second in that case. Just let's take a pause on the live stream once this thing sets itself back up.
Okay. While we're taking a pause, I would like to ask everyone to make sure to press the like button in the live stream and share the link. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Sangar, can you hear me?
Yes, everything is fine now. Carry on.
Okay, let's just give it 60 seconds just to test that it remains like this. Bro, there's like this mad communist in the live chat. He distracted me again.
Yes, unlike the communists, we believe in freedom of speech, so carry on saying whatever you want.
You know, we should probably say that in the live chat. You know what? I'm going to say that at the end of the podcast. Somewhere across the podcast, I'm going to say, "Don't worry, we're not going to pull out your tongue for stating your opinion."
Okay, carry on, carry on.
Okay, sure. So where were we, Sangar?
Yeah, so we were discussing the fact that Masood was basically offered a independent.
Autonomous Tajik region under his control. And now so that's important because you just did a very good job of analysis of Soviet intentions in late 1988. Now the fact that it's late 1988 is important because the Soviets obviously withdrew in February 1989. Now, before they withdrew, there was obviously the signing of the Geneva Accords, which was between the government, Najib's government in Kabul, the government of Pakistan, America, as well as the Soviet Union, which was basically to say there's going to be something of a political process and that all sides should stop arming the other side. Now, the massive glaring point over here is that the Mujahideen were not consulted. Because the Mujahideen were not consulted, they didn't consider themselves bound by the Geneva Accords, which meant that war went on, which meant that all of the parties continued supporting their clients in any case. So the Mujahideen were supported by the Americans and the Pakistanis, and the Soviets continued giving Najib massive amounts of support, $3 to $4 billion a year. And so war went on as always. But so in February 1989, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. The last soldier withdrew. Do you remember there being a day of national relief, Sangar?
Yes, Najib announced the national Roz Najat Mili, the
Mm-hmm.
National Day of Salvation,
Mm-hmm.
and that really angered the Soviets because they were really upset about the fact that this guy has basically sort of declared an Independence Day after Soviet troop withdrawal, while he attended the whole withdrawal ceremony. I was there as well as a kid. They took us from our school, typical communist school system. I was really young. I was, I think, 6. I was one of those early kids who was so unfortunate to go a year ahead of his time to school. And I was really young, and they put on these white shirts and red scarves around our necks, and we walked for a long time
Did you
through this.
sing any songs?
No, I didn't knew any songs. We didn't sing any songs, but they took us to the ceremony, and you saw all these tanks and Russian soldiers standing, and loads of journalists with their cameras. And Najib was on a stage, and he was giving a speech. And then in front of all these journalists, they paraded us as kids, as trophies. And one of these Russian guys, he picked me up and
As the fruits of the revolution.
yeah, and they took pictures of me in the hand of this Russian soldier. So maybe that radicalized me of becoming very Ikhwani. But then a few days later, I was at my grandfather's house, and someone came and said, "Look, your grandson is in the newspaper. A Russian soldier was holding him." Now if I think about it, it was like really embarrassing, but that really happened to me. But so Najib, he basically organized the whole theater, the whole ceremony of all our Soviet allies. They are leaving, but once they were gone, he announced National Day of Salvation, which was very politically savvy, because he wanted to show the people that I wasn't really in favor of the Soviet occupation. And I believe that it's a good thing that the Soviets have left. Just like Ashraf Ghani in Khost a few months ago, he said that I am responsible for departure of the Americans. I kicked the Americans out. So similarly, Dr. Najib also wanted to be seen as the guy who played a major role in Soviet withdrawal, and the day of national salvation, the name, Najat Mili, national salvation, it really angered not just the Soviets, but a lot of people in his own party, a lot of people from his own faction, Parchamis. They were like, what the hell? What do you mean national salvation? From what? From us? So that was a really controversial step.
Yeah. But so what happens? Oh my. So yeah. So the Russians actually withdraw, and now across the Durand Line in Pakistan, in Islamabad, or rather in Rawalpindi, uh, things are brewing. Okay, so the Director General of the ISI at this time was General Hamid Gul. General Hamid Gul was an Afghan. He was a Pashtun from Pakistan. I believe he was a Yusuf Zay. And essentially, the idea was that with the momentum that the Mujahideen had sort of gained, first and foremost by achieving the expulsion of foreign troops, that they should now go on the offensive. That this was the time. So, how should they go on the offensive? The way they should go on the offensive, as articulated by Hamid Gul, but not just Hamid Gul, by Hikmatyar as well. And Hikmatyar was obviously very close to the Pakistani military and security establishment. The way that this was argued to take advantage of this momentum was to capture a city in Afghanistan. And after capturing a city in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen could be said to control meaningful territory in Afghanistan. They could sort of declare a government there. It could be their capital. Now, which city was this? It was Jalalabad. Initially, actually, however, it wasn't just planned to be Jalalabad. It was planned that within 1 year, three major cities would fall to the Mujahideen, all of them close to the Durand line. First being Jalalabad, second Khost, third being Kandahar. And this was the time in which a lot of these, toward the latter stages of the jihad against the Soviets, a lot of these Arab overseas fighters had come over. So the Battle of Jalalabad was the first real test for Najib in the context of the withdrawal of Soviet forces. So in the Battle of Jalalabad, Hizb-e-Islami, I believe, Sayyaf's faction, Haqqani sent some of his soldiers, a lot of these Arabs, these people were all involved. Now, curiously, Ahmad Shah Massoud was not involved in the Battle of Jalalabad, and that led to further
He was
trouble.
he was never involved in any major battle in the south or anywhere.
So, but here's the thing. It was hoped that Ahmad Shah Massoud would use his position in the Panjshir to block the Salang road that connected Kabul to northern Afghanistan. However, as it turned out, unfortunately for Hikmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud just, and to be fair, I mean, once again, there are two arguments to make here. The first is that this was a cynical move by Ahmad Shah Massoud to disrupt and delay any sort of success of Hikmatyar, who by this stage was a fierce rival of his. The other was that this was a very poorly planned, poorly coordinated military offensive. And as such, there was really little military benefit or any benefit for Ahmad Shah Massoud for himself to be involved in it. So the Battle of Jalalabad, and by the way, both of these things can be true.
Yes.
One does not negate the other, right? Now, the Battle of Jalalabad was really the first test for Najib's government in the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal, and essentially Najib won. His army won.
Small
The Mujahid,
detail, uh,
yeah,
General Abdurrahim Wardak, the previous, the former Minister of Defense under Karzai, he was basically the, the leader of the whole Jalalabad offensive.
okay,
Okay, he was leading the offensive. Now, you can obviously see why it was such a major disaster, because Abdurrahim Wardak, while he was the Minister of Defense under Karzai, he wasn't very successful at defeating the Taliban, even though 49 or 50 countries from around the world were on his side. And yeah, he was, by the way, recently in the news because his son
his
purchased
son.
a mansion for $20 million in Florida. But basically, this man was put in charge of the entire Jalalabad offensive, which was a historic disaster for the Mujahideen.
It was a massive failure because the Mujahideen by this stage had underestimated their opponent, especially Hikmatyar's Hizb Islami had basically fought a really brutal guerrilla war. This was a frontal assault on a major city that was well fortified. It was close to Kabul, so it was well supplied. And it consisted of different factions who, for the last 10 years, had been fighting separately with no sort of unified chain of command, no sort of familiarity between them. And so, like I said, both of those things about Ahmad Shah Massoud can be true. But Jalalabad is not the end of the challenges for Dr. Najib, because in March 1990, there was a coup attempt against him. What do you have to say about that, Sengar?
Well, the coup against Dr. Najib was organized by the Khalqis under the leadership of Shanawaz Tanai. I think, for most of our listeners, if you don't know, when Najib became the president, he tried to bring as much as he could people to the fold. So he gave a lot of very prominent roles to people who were politically opposed to him or people who belonged to a different faction. Even when he became president, his cabinet ministers, there were many cabinet ministers who weren't actually part of the Communist Party. Okay? They were actually people from the time of Zahir Shah and Dawood. He made them cabinet ministers because he believed that, he is such a great leader. He can bring everyone together. And he gave a lot of power to these Khalqi figures like Shanawaz Tanai, who conspired against him.
But do you know why?
Well,
Because he felt threatened by the Karmali faction within his own Parchami party. So this is
I doubt that. I disagree.
don't
I don't think that Najib was afraid of the Karmalis in his own government, because he trusted these guys. He believed that even though some of them were arrested, some of them were sent to prison because they opposed him, because they protested against him in Kabul. Some of them were exiled, sent to Soviet Union, and despite all of that, he still believed that they are his men. They are from his side. So it's not like he
but
felt.
that's not to say that he saw them as enemies,
Yes.
but couldn't you say that by placing Khalqis in powerful positions strategically, you could basically ensure that neither side gets too powerful?
Yes, that makes much more sense.
Do you
I
see
would
what I'm
agree with
so
that.
so we spoke about Shahnawaz Tanay. He became the Minister of Defense after 2 to 6 months in which the position was vacant because Ahmed Shah Massoud was being offered the job. Now, as it turns out, Ahmed Shah Massoud didn't actually accept. But in the months leading up to the coup, uh, a Khalqi plot at a coup d'etat had been discovered and hundreds of Khalqi officers had been arrested. What was interesting about the Shahnawaz Tanay coup, however, was that it was launched in collaboration with, who was it launched with, Sangar?
Gulbuddin Hekmatyar.
There's something shady. There's always engineer Saib Hekmatyar not too far from it. But in any case, so that coup d'etat actually failed. Now, now here's the thing. From why would a radical Khalqi, much more radical and ideological in his outlook than Najib, by the way, ally with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar,
Because he
who
was a
was the
Tanay.
Oh, I mean, there's that, but there's also the idea that this was sort of a convenient marriage for the two of them. And Hikmatyar later said, well, we have promised amnesty to all communist officials who defect to us. Shahnawaz Tanay has defected to us, and therefore, uh, like this is something I've discussed with my father, who was in Hizb Islami as well. And I asked him, I was like, Father, like, how do you reconcile the most anti-communist faction allying with the most rabid communist? And my father said, and it's a valid perspective, I personally disagree with him on it, right? But my father said, look, you're trying to overthrow a government, okay? You're trying to overthrow a government, and the Minister of Defense is getting in bed with you. Are you going to tell him that you're not willing to cooperate with him? And so I think, as always, it comes down to an issue of principle versus pragmatism. And there's always that gray area in between that you can never really truly reconcile. But for a lot of people in Hizb Islami, that coup attempt was the moment where they thought maybe our leader is a bit too hungry for power. But here's the thing. Hikmatyar's own family had been killed by the Khalqis. So Hikmatyar himself was not positively predisposed toward the Khalqis. He saw this as a necessary evil to accelerate the downfall of the Najib regime. But there's also something else that's very interesting. I'm going to ask you a question, Sangar. Who were these words said by? The Tanay coup d'etat was not defeated by Najib, but by our people in the army.
Ahmad Shah Massoud.
Exactly. Ahmad Shah Massoud bragged and boasted quite a lot about the fact that it was his informants and his agents in the Afghan army that by that point, as we understand, is that Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces had deeply infiltrated Najib's government, and they were the ones that essentially told him about this coup plot against him, and they were the ones that had foiled it. And once again, according to night letters, Najib had confided in friends that it wasn't Massoud he was scared about. He was scared about Hikmatyar. Now, another quote here is that um, Massoud had told his intelligence chief, we don't want to help the ISI or Hikmatyar. So once again, we see that Najib's longevity in power was greatly aided by the pre-existing divisions amongst the different Mujahideen
But
heads.
that's a claim of Massoud. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
That is a common understanding. I'm going to challenge you. What do you, I don't want to challenge you. Okay, my bad. Maybe not the right word, but I'm going to ask you, do you have something to challenge Massoud's? Because Massoud is bragging here. He's
Okay.
saying that we were the ones that foiled this.
Okay, so here is the thing. Here's something that you should know about the Communist Party in Afghanistan. Whether they were Parchami or they were Khalqi, uh, these guys, they would work during the day, and in the evening they would go and sit together and drink and talk. And there was always, this is the nature of government in these circumstances, that they have all their informants in different groups and different factions. This is typical KGB style of operating. That they have informants within their own network, informing each other about who's saying what to whom. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and these khalqis, they would sit, get together, and they would talk about overthrowing Najib. And all their conversations, whatever they were saying with each other, some of it was actually even recorded, okay, by Khad.
Mm-hmm.
There were informants within their own group. They were reporting back to Khad, and they were saying, this is what Tanai is planning, this is what he's doing. The reason why the Minister of Defense failed in overthrowing the regime was because they knew days in advance that this is what he's doing. Because these guys, they would
So why
talk.
didn't they arrest him then?
Basically, that there is always chatter. Okay, when
Mm-hmm.
people get drunk and they sit together, there's always chatter. But not all chatter actually materializes into action, because when the Russians decided that they need to replace Karmal, there was also a lot of chatter. Okay, but that didn't necessarily mean that these Parchami loyalists of Karmal are going to try to overthrow the government. So there's always chatter, but then there is this critical moment when chatter is uh, actually conspiring against the government and actually taking actions against them. So that's why when they finally figured out that this is what they're going to do, a lot of their men were arrested. One of them was our neighbor. He lived in the same flat building as us. I used to play with his sons. And then one day his father was arrested. And it was because the Khad knew what they were up to. And that's why it never really materialized into anything significant. On the other hand, it is true that there were many people inside the government who were uh, uh, providing Ahmad Shah Massoud with intel. That's not a lie. Ahmad Shah Massoud wasn't exaggerating or bragging. There were many people within Khalq and within Parcham faction who were in contact with Ahmad Shah Massoud. That's like here in the Netherlands and Germany, there are many Parchamis who are now sort of openly saying that they support Ahmad Shah Massoud and he's a national hero. But when they used to be part of the government, obviously they wouldn't reveal their sympathies towards him, but they were actually his informants.
Well, but in any case, so that Shahnawaz Tanay, after that failed coup, basically went to Pakistan and was received by the ISI and Gulbuddin. And I think another point to mention here is that in 1990, Najib came out with another constitution. And this constitution, he basically said that Afghanistan was an Islamic state. All references to Marxism, communism, Leninism were removed. Um, the president was required to be of Muslim faith, be a good Muslim. And essentially, whilst all of this politics is ongoing, um, we see that Najib is transitioning further and further away from Marxism in contradiction of his promises to his own party and basically forming himself somewhat of an Afghan nationalist, which is why, as we'll get to it, his legacy is sort of seen favorably because he gave really good speeches about Afghan nationalism and patriotism. And I swear to you, I'm not trying to be patronizing there, but that is what it is. His speeches were touching, deeply heartfelt, and so on and so forth. So rather than arguing against the Mujahideen as to why communism was better than Islam, he would just say that the Mujahideen's jihad is not really a jihad, that come and make peace and that they were the slaves of foreign powers and so on and so forth. Um, Now, let me just do a final check. Okay, and as we said, Najib's policy towards these different militias was essentially, so he was getting about $3 to $4 billion a year of aid from the Soviet Union. And so, whilst there was a lot of money, sorry, he had a lot of guns as well, but he also essentially his policy in order to prolong his regime was what Knight Letters refers to as state-sponsored bribery, which is a description that I personally agree with. And it wasn't just militia leaders and mujahideen commanders who he was trying to pay to get them to drop their arms, but apparently the soldiers of the Afghan army, their salaries increased 5 to 10 fold in the final year of the Soviet occupation. 500,000 government employees relied on handouts of cooking oil and flour, and militia commanders and local bands of insurgents were sent shipping containers full of freshly minted banknotes in exchange for their loyalty. Now, obviously, one of these militia commanders was um, Abdul Rashid Dostum, and Dostum was notorious not just for his brutality, but also for the fact that his men were big time looters. I think they were called, what is it called?
Gilam Jam.
Gilam Jam, the collectors of rugs and carpets.
And you know why? Because there was another militia leader called Amanullah Gilam Jam. He was
Okay,
from the same region as uh, Dostum
okay,
in the early years. And Amanullah Ghulam Jam was very effective in fighting against the Mujahideen. And Amanullah Ghulam Jam, he would say, yes, we went to that district, we went to Ghormach, and we Galamishana Jam Kadim. We rolled up their rug. We cleaned them up. We sorted them out. So he was always saying Galamishana Jam Kadim. We rolled up their rug. Basically, we got rid of them, and that Galam Jam became very popular. And then when Dostum became basically the most effective and most powerful warlord, basically people called all these Uzbek militiamen Gulam Jam, Gulam Jami or Gulam Jam, and that's how that term became very popular. Even today, you see people they call basically all militias and guys from the north Gulam Jam, which doesn't make much sense. I would say even that's even actually quite racist to
mm-hmm.
just on wholesale label people Gulam Jam, but that's the origin of that term.
So I think we've covered his presidency pretty much in detail. So just to wrap it up, so Najib presided over a period of the Soviet occupation and after the Soviet occupation in which security was subcontracted to militia commanders. One of those commanders, Ismat Muslim, he managed to keep Ismat Muslim on side. Ismat Muslim actually tried to barge his way into the Loya Jirga of 1987. Another, for example, militia leader was Nasima Khunzada in Helmand, who also made a lot of money from the opium trade. There was obviously Abdul Rashid Dostum as well. Now, Dostum had been enlisted in the Afghan army before Najib became president, but it was under Najib that he really became promoted. And there were a lot of, I think it's worth mentioning as well, a lot of Mujahideen commanders or just foot soldiers generally left the battle after the Soviets left because they weren't really concerned with the government in Kabul because the government in Kabul didn't really affect them. So after the Soviets left, they said, well, that's our jihad done. And now Najib is Dr. Najibullah. So
Yeah.
my job is basically done here. I
I
don't have
think it's
anything
it's a
else.
very important moment that we should take a short break before we move on to the collapse of the Najib regime. So we are reaching the 2 hour mark. So
Mhm.
we will take a short break and then we will be back. And then we will talk about the collapse of Najib. So bear with us. We will be back in like 5 minutes.
Sure.
All right. All right, guys. So we are back. Um, Walid. So we were discussing how Dr. Najibullah, after the withdrawal of Soviet troops, basically was in a process of implementing his national policy of reconciliation while he was empowering all these militias who were causing havoc across the country. And this policy was deeply unpopular among people all across the country. And you also mentioned that he was bribing people. An important point that we should mention is that Najib, during his policy of national reconciliation, he was also trying to bribe a lot of Mujahideen commanders. And aside from trying to reach out to the communists to the Mujahideen by giving these speeches and talking about how the war against him was not legitimate because the Soviets have left and he has declared the day of national salvation. Uh, Still, he was also trying to bribe commanders from different factions, from Hizb Islami and Jamiat and all other factions, to side with him or sabotage their own insurgent group. Uh, this is something that a lot of people forget or that don't like to acknowledge that yes, Najib was trying to reconcile with the Mujahideen. uh, on the surface it appeared like he was trying to make peace with them, but at the same time he was also trying to sabotage them. And his attempts of trying to sabotage the Mujahideen and sow discord among different groups, uh, people do not really understand how that has affected the insurgency, the Mujahideen factions, and how that basically incentivized different people to see the whole war as a way to become more powerful, more rich. And uh, now that we are in a stage in our history where we look back at this, and some people say, well, Najib, yes, he was part of the communist government, and yes, he initially he was the head of Khad, but then he wanted to make peace and he wanted to create a national government of national unity. Um, at the same time, we have to also bear in mind that when you go around giving people money and telling them uh,
And
switch,
weapons.
yeah, and weapons, and switch over to our side, you may be able to weaken uh, the insurgents, but you are creating a monster. You're creating a monster, small monsters all across the country who are entirely motivated by power and wealth. And those people, uh, if you don't have a strategy, if you don't have a policy of dealing with them after sabotaging their insurgency, what's going to happen next? What are they going to do next?
Yeah. Well, so that's basically a summary of Najib, and I know there's actually been a lot of chatter from what I can see. I actually had to mute someone in the live chat because they were causing so much controversy about us being critical of him. Look, this is the thing: is that what we're reading out or what we're saying, these aren't opinions. Okay, an opinion is the following: Dr. Najib was an extremely destructive man in Afghanistan's recent history. That's an opinion. Okay, this is a fact. There are testimonies detailing brutal torture when Dr. Najib was head of Khad. Another fact: Dostum's career was launched by Dr. Najib, right? These are fact. We're not talking about opinions, or we may have analyzed Ahmad Shah Massoud's motives for doing this or that, but what we're saying about Najib in terms of containers filled with cash, weaponry, militias, these are all facts. So as much as the live chat has not been very receptive towards some of those facts, it's okay, because we're not gonna pull your fingernails out or put things inside you. uh because we obviously have, I have family who disappeared and were never seen for doing much less than stating disagreements. But let's move on swiftly, Sangal. So I think in terms of characterizing the collapse of Najib's regime, I think one thing that's overlooked psychologically in its importance is the fall of Khost. Okay. Khost had been besieged by the Mujahideen for about 11 years, roughly around 11 years. From about 1980, the Soviets had launched repeated attacks against Khost, including one, I believe, in 1987. There was one in 1987 in Zazi in Paktia, but I believe in around 1987, 1988, there was a massive offensive against Haqqani's camp. I believe it's called Jawar. I've only read it in English, but Jawar in Pashto means deep. Another thing that we need to note is that whilst national reconciliation sped up during Najib's time, a lot of the major offensives were also launched in Najib's time. I mentioned Arghandab, 1987, 1988. We've got the offensive against Jawar. So these things were seen as going hand in hand with the political process that Najib was inaugurating. But in 1991, the first major city, if we can call it that, collapsed to the Mujahideen, and it had been besieged by the Mujahideen for 11 years. Even the Soviets weren't able to lift the siege. They had to supply the city via its airport, right? And that was the fall of Khost. And then things moved relatively quickly afterwards. So essentially, Najib's regime was a recipient of billions of dollars worth of aid from the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union withdrew rather, but the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Okay. And as the regime in Kabul was very dependent on the supply lines coming from the north, because the Soviet Union bordered Afghanistan to its north, Najib was very anxious to control the roads that were leading to Kabul from the north. And as such, he actually he tried to replace the commander, I believe, at Hairatan port, called General Momin, who was a Farsi one. And he tried to replace him with the general commander of the northern zone, a guy called Jama Atakzai, who was Atakzai Pashtun from Farah.
Juma
Now,
Atak,
what
he wouldn't be called Atakzai, but Juma Atak.
Attack, but a lot of these people have really ridiculous names. But the reason it was Atak is because he was an Atakzai, and he was an Atakzai from Farah. So Najib tried to, and the problem with Jama Atak was also that he was rumored to be pretty racist. Um, and so that essentially was the straw that broke the camel's back. A press conference was convened, a mutiny ensued. Uh, there was a mutiny. Mazar Sharif slipped out of Najib's hands. An alliance was made between Dostum, between Hizb Wahdat, between the mutineering officers in Najib's army who were complaining that he was playing ethnic politics. Ahmad Shah Massoud was in this coalition. The Ismaili Pir of Baghlan was also in this coalition. And that essentially is what led to the collapse of Najib's
I think,
regime.
with regards to General Momin, what is very important to note is that it wasn't Najib just replacing Momin because he was a Tajik and he didn't like
Of
Tajiks.
course, of course.
What is an important detail, and this is because General Momin in Hairatan, what was happening at that time, there is no video. Where are you?
Yeah, sorry, just give me a second.
Okay, so General Momin, who was responsible for the port of Hairatan, during Najib's era, there were a lot of tradesmen, businessmen who were importing goods through the port of Hayratan from Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, to Afghanistan. And Momin's guys at the port of Hayratan, they were extorting these tradesmen. They were harassing them. They were beating them up. They were taking money from them. And these tradesmen, they all complained to the Ministry of Trade, to the government, and they said that we are trying to import goods into the country, but this man, Momin at Hayratan, he is intimidating us, he's threatening us, he's extorting us. And this was an act of sabotage by Momin. Okay? This was a deliberate act of sabotage of the government. And what's important to note is that in Afghanistan, the most prominent, most significant businessmen were in those times. Even today, there are generally people who are Kuchi or Pashtuns, and most of these tradesmen were Pashtuns, and Momin would deliberately target these Pashtuns. Okay. So there was an ethnic aspect to this whole, problem at the port of Hayratan, and people complained repeatedly to Najib about what Momin was doing, and the decision to replace Momin didn't just fall out of the sky. There were many attempts to basically lobby Najib and the authorities and tell them to get rid of this guy, but it didn't happen. It took quite a while until Momin was replaced, but the replacing of Momin led to the situation that you described. And I think it's also important for our audience to understand that the Soviet Union, before the Communist Revolution, even before the rise of Daoud as a leader who overthrew the monarchy, the Soviet Union has always maintained a relationship with different groups in Afghanistan, with different factions, and they had separate relationship with all these different groups, with ethnic minorities. The Russians had a relationship with Saza. Saza was an ethno-nationalist leftist party. The Setami party, the Setam party, was also had a very close relationship with the KGB. So the KGB was also maintaining a relationship with Khalqis and Parchami separately. And if you want to understand this better, you need to listen to Yuri Bezmenov. His speeches are on YouTube, very popular, former KGB operative who defected to United States. And in the late 1980s, early 90s, he gave many speeches and many interviews about the way the KGB was subverting the United States and other countries by maintaining relationship with different ethnic minorities, groups, all sorts of factions, and they were subverting every society by creating rifts in every society and trying to empower these groups so that they can challenge central authority. And this is a very typical Soviet strategy of subversion. And Yuri Bezmenov, you guys really have to listen to him because he explained this much better than I do. But this is what the Soviet Union was doing in Afghanistan. Now, once the Khalqis they tried to overthrow Dawood, and basically they announced their communist revolution, the Soviets were concerned, obviously, because they didn't want a very unstable, radical regime that results into civil war and, just in their southern border. They didn't want that. Obviously, they preferred a pro-Soviet government in Kabul, but they didn't want to have a situation where that government might collapse and fall into the hands of pro-American groups. They had these concerns, so they also maintained relationship with Parchamis, and as we have discussed and as you have written about it in your article, they also had relationships with Ahmad Shah Massoud. So the Soviets, they weren't exactly convinced that they should only support Marxist, Leninists, and their support wasn't ideological. It was a very clever way of playing different groups against each other, even if it means that those groups were actually ideologically opposed to the whole Marxist-Leninist doctrine that created the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, they knew that they couldn't keep their troops in Afghanistan. They were forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. But withdrawing from Afghanistan, the idea wasn't to create a new government that is a centralized, powerful government that is not aligned with Soviet Union. If it's not ours, if it cannot be ours, then it shouldn't be anyone's. So that's why they try.
Sounds familiar.
Yes. So that's why they try to support different groups like Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they maintain the relationship with these Parchami opponents of Dr. Najib's regime inside his own government, people like Nabi Azimi, Mahmoud Barialeh, all these guys, the whole Karmal crew, they were basically maintaining ties with the Russians. So the intrigue in Hayratan should be seen as part of a elaborate strategy to undermine Najib in his efforts to basically transform Afghanistan into a government that is no longer aligned with the Soviet Union, but still has a strong central government where there is some sort of stability. The Russians didn't want that, so that's why they supported these groups like the Karmal faction, these warlords like Dostum.
So let's just recap on the collapse of the government, okay? And the date I'm going to put at which our conversation ends, let's say roughly, is the 15th of April 1992. Okay, so Najib's replaced or tries to replace General Momin, right, with General Jamaatek or Atakzai. Okay, Dostum, Momin, Massoud, who've all been in contact, by the way. Momin, apparently, according to some sources, was providing intel for Massoud for a very long time. Okay, Hizb Wahdat, the Ismaili group, these guys basically form a coalition to basically say, and I believe Dostum said himself, the Pashtuns have enjoyed themselves and had cars for a long time, and now it's our turn. Okay, so that the rhetoric, what was exploited specifically in order to gain as much support as possible, was ethnicity. That was ethnicity that was weaponized. Okay, now Nabi Azimi is sent by Najib to negotiate, right, with this faction who have mutinied and taken control of Mazar-e-Sharif. Nabi Azimi himself defects to this faction. Najib realizes that the war is lost, right? I'm surrounded, and he agrees to resign. Okay, now agreement is sort of reached that Najib will step down, there'll be an interim government, elections, and everything will be rosy. We know that doesn't happen because Hikmatyar and Massoud are also jockeying against each other. And because Massoud is now allied with Dostum, Massoud flies in Dostum's militiamen into Kabul to take positions at key, to put to basically put checkpoints at key positions in the upcoming war. That obviously irritates Hekmatyar, attacks Kabul, the rest is history, right? Now, obviously, Sanket, you've got family that were sort of in contact with Najib, right? That worked with Najib for quite a number of years and who were there from the inside as this whole structure unraveled and collapsed. What did it look like from the inside? What really went on? Who, let's say, betrayed Najib? Who, what, when, where, why? And once you've answered that, I think so. Probably the best note on which to end this live stream. Once you've answered that, but I'm going to give you the floor. What happened? Who did what? Why? And how?
Okay, so as I said before, I explained that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, um, and they were maintaining their ties with different factions. The Karmal faction within the Parchami faction of Hizb Democratic Khalq consisted of many people who were ethnic Tajiks, or generally they were not Pashtuns. There were also many Pashtun Parchamis who were very loyal to Karmal, but they were not part of this elaborate scheme. They were on a less prominent position within that group. This group, when they saw that Karmal is being replaced by Najib, some of them protested and overtly expressed their discontent with Najib becoming the new leader. And once they saw that Karmal is out of the picture permanently, this group became more organized. Some of them would go to prison temporarily. They would be arrested for speaking against the government and basically radicalizing other members of the party. But others were more shrewd and more sophisticated, like Nabi Azimi and many other powerful and influential figures. They wouldn't go out and openly and overtly speak out against Najib. Like, for instance, you just mentioned Dr. Najib sent Nabi Azimi to negotiate on his behalf without actually knowing that Nabi Azimi is actually part of the conspiracy against him. And this is very important to note because we're talking about Dr. Najib. You know, you have these speeches of Dr. Najib on YouTube and Facebook. People listen to those speeches and they say, look, he was like Nostradamus. He knew that this is going to happen, that one day the Americans will invade Afghanistan. And he knew that if his government collapses, all these factions will fight with each other and they will fight street to street, house to house against each other. People think that he was a clairvoyant, okay? But he wasn't clairvoyant.
Mystic Meg.
Yeah, but he wasn't really able to actually see what was happening under his own nose. His own top dog, Nabi Azimi, who he sent to negotiate on his behalf, he was actually part of the conspiracy to overthrow his government. And now here's the interesting part. The Karmal faction within his party, people who were part of the central committee of his party, okay? The central committee was the ruling body of the party, okay?
Yeah.
Initially, the central committee consisted of like 9 people or something in the initial phase of the government. Then it grew to 150 people. At one time, my father was also in that central committee. But in the central committee, there were many people who were loyal to Karmal. And these people, they were opposed to Najib, his national reconciliation policy, his overtures towards this Mujahideen factions. So they wanted to preserve their power, and they thought that if they collaborate with Ahmad Shah Massoud and Dostum and all these guys, they will get rid of Najib, and then together they will oppose the most powerful warlord, the most powerful Mujahideen leader, Hekmatyar, who was basically doing most of the fighting against them. So
The
they,
biggest villain.
yeah, the biggest villain. But the thing is that Najib, uh, his own Khad, his own intelligence service, who was monitoring all these people. He had his informants everywhere. They were collecting information about all these people, their activities, the fact that they were talking to Massoud. All these details about relationship of his own Parchamis with Massoud, he received the intel and he refused to believe it. He said,
Why?
these men, they are our comrades from day one. They fought with us shoulder to shoulder, and they are part of what we have achieved so far. They would never betray us. Yes, they might disagree with me. They might have different views and opinions, but they will never side with the
With the
Ashrar.
Ashrar.
Yes, against us. He refused to believe that because he thought that these guys, the Karmal faction, they were just unhappy with the decision, but he didn't wanted to believe that.
Discontented comrades.
Yes, and that's the thing. See, he as a leader, he was someone who actually believed in his own myth that he is so wise and knowledgeable that he
Okay.
can transform the whole party and the whole history of Afghanistan and reach some new situation where even if he organizes an election, most people will vote for him. You know, he was convinced that
A megalomaniac.
sort of, yes, yes. And for that reason, he didn't want to act against these people. There was another major reason why he didn't act against them, even though he received intel about them being somehow involved in a conspiracy against him, because he said, look, I'm here giving speeches, walking around every part of the country, telling people that we should reunite and that we should reconcile. And then at the same time, if people hear that I am accusing my own ministers and generals of being conspirators, nobody is going to believe my national reconciliation policy. They will assume that I am lying and I'm deceiving them. I'm locking up my own comrades. So that's why he didn't want to act against those people.
I see.
And what happened is that despite receiving all this information, Najib was persistent on the fact that any sort of threat against him will come from a different angle, not from that particular particular group. And when Najib basically fell in a trap, okay, with the fall of Mazar, it was already too late. It was already too late. And what most people say is that Najib's regime collapsed because he no longer received any supplies from Soviet Union. He didn't have any fuel and he didn't have any weapons. So that's not true, because the Soviet Union provided his government with so many supplies. He had a surplus of weapons. He had a surplus of fuel and food. So he could easily continue for a few more years. But the reason why,
and I'm assuming most of those ammunition caches and depots went the way of the northern group that mutinied against him.
yes, his entire military apparatus was in the hands of people who were loyal to Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they surrendered all those military depots to Massoud. What's also very important to note is that in those years that Dr. Najib was pursuing his national reconciliation policy, uh, from a historic perspective, most people, they don't really realize this, but most of the fighting in Afghanistan was happening in the south of Kabul, Logar, Maidan Wardak, Nangarhar, Kunar, Laghman, Paktika, Ghazni, Uruzgan, Zabul, Helmand. That's where the Soviets were fighting, and when the Soviets left, that's where Najib's forces were doing most of their fighting, and he was using brutal force against people in those regions. He had very deadly weapons like Scud missiles, the Katyushas, Uragans. You can go and Google those things, what kind of weapons they are and how much destruction they cause. And I remember as a kid in Kabul at night, when it was dark, we would see flashes over the skies of Kabul, and I was always wondering what's happening, and I was being told in Rishkhor, where even the Americans built a training facility for special forces in Rishkhor, that was the facility for launching Scud missiles. And Scud missile is just short of being a nuclear bomb. And he was using that against Khost and Paktia, Ningrar, Kunar, all those regions. While in the north, there wasn't a lot of fighting going on, but his own men who was in charge of his armed forces, they were using all that brutal force against the south while secretly being in cahoots with Ahmad Shah Massoud. And his hubris, Najib's hubris of assuming that, he will succeed because people like his fiery speeches, and, there was a lot of, people saw him like a very charismatic leader, and he thought that he is very charismatic. And he couldn't actually believe that his own men would conspire against him. So the conspiracy was coming from within his own party, and
I
those
see.
people were doing this obviously because they didn't want to lose their power and prestige. They assumed that if they conspire with Ahmad Shah Massoud, Ahmad Shah Massoud will make them ministers, and he will give them a role in his government, but he didn't.
Which
And
is funny because those negotiations I mentioned between Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Russians, what he told the Russians is that you guys and your soldiers have been sent into a pointless war. We want good relations with you, but I will never forgive the communists in Kabul, right? And Hikmatyar also had a similar thing about no sort of quarter given to the communists of Kabul. And in the end, they allied with those communists and destroyed the city against one another. And I think it's
one important point is that after the withdrawal of all Soviet troops, what did the Russians do? They invited Rabbani, Maulay Nabi Muhammadi, and all these other guys to Moscow, and basically that was in 1990, and basically sort of did a Doha on them. Okay, they did a Doha deal on Najib in 1990 by inviting everyone except Hikmatyarov. Obviously, they didn't want to.
obviously.
But the Russians were not really hiding the fact that they were trying to conspire against Najib, and Najib was under the impression that he's so popular and he's so beloved and so successful that he will even succeed despite the fact that Russians don't like him, and that the Russians are upset, and that the Russians don't like his announcement of day of salvation. He didn't want to believe that, and that was the real cause of his downfall. That was the reason why he failed, and that's why I think I want to be very honest about what I feel about Najib. Yes, my entire family, everyone worked for for Najib government. Yes, I went to school where his wife was the principal and his brother's wife was my teacher. Uh, I am from that community. I cannot defend Najib and praise him and glorify him and say that he was a saint. And but at the same time, I want to say that yes, he actually thought that what he was doing may somehow create stability. He was actually convinced that their communist revolution was detrimental for Afghan society. He was actually convinced that Afghanistan didn't need a communist government, and Afghanistan didn't need a radical communist policy of taking land, redistributing it, and
Sangar, can you increase your volume?
is I think my volume is maximum. Okay, so all these matters are important to know about Najib. Najib was actually convinced that his party, he even created a new party, Hezb-Watan. Okay, so he changed the name of the party and he announced that from now on his party is no longer called Hezb Demokratik Khalq Afghanistan but Hezb Watan, because he wanted to rebrand himself, he wanted to rebrand his party, all because he thought that the path that they were pursuing was misguided, but at the same time he was not the clairvoyant leader who was capable of knowing what's going to happen in the future, because he became a victim of a conspiracy by his own loyalists, his own people. And we see that now that we are 30 years ahead, we see that his government was basically sabotaged by Russians and his own people, and his collapse, the collapse of his regime, the last few years that he was inside the UN compound in Kabul with Ishaq Touhi. He was praying tahajjud every night. He was praying 5 times a day. He was very, very religious, and he would tell Ishaq Touhi that I was wrong, that I didn't believe people when they were saying that my own comrades are conspiring against me, and that he regretted trusting those people. But obviously, I don't think that he regretted the fact that he basically pursued a policy that sort of created his own demise, because otherwise he would have used his time in the UN compound to maybe make an announcement, write a book or whatever to say, look guys, I was wrong. But he didn't. He didn't do that. So I think, if we go now to the time when Kabul fell to the Taliban and the Taliban took over the city and he was brutally killed, there are people there saying the ISI came and they told him, look, you need to sign this document so that Durand Line is officially recognized and that Afghanistan never makes a claim on Pakhtunkhwa, and that this is the reason why he was killed. That doesn't make any sense. We have had an entire podcast of more than 2 hours explaining the whole history of Durand Line. And if you listen to the entire podcast, then you will realize that Dr. Najib couldn't possibly sign any document. He wasn't actually a president. He wasn't actually a leader. He didn't have any sort of authority to sign any document. So why would the Pakistanis want him to sign any document? No, he was killed because the Taliban come from the south of Afghanistan, from rural parts of Afghanistan. Those people, they saw the brutality of his regime. They lost relatives, they lost their dear ones to his brutality, and this was an act of revenge. They killed him because they wanted revenge, and it is in no way uh, uh, it's not something that the ISI wanted to do. Even if they did wanted to do, those guys who took over Kabul,
It wouldn't be because of the Durand line.
yes, those guys who took over Kabul, they came from Uruzgan, from Logar, from Ghazni. They didn't know much better than this communist guy. He used Scud missiles against us. He sent our relatives to torture camps. He did this and he did that and he did that. That's how they saw him. That's
And
their impression.
I remember there's a video of Mullah Rabbani, who was the Taliban's prime minister. And I remember the exact dialogue actually said, Dr. Najib, de millat loy qatil, the Islam star mukhrib, did او دوغه جزا سزا ورسید, which is essentially Najib was a murderer of the nation. He was a saboteur of Islam, and based on those crimes, he was executed. And so I think that's a. I'm just going to do a very quick summary, Sangar, on because you've. I'm being told the volume is too low.
Okay, I've increased your volume. Guys, I cannot increase my volume anymore because then I will sound very distorted.
Okay, so
Test,
I'm going to
test.
just thank you for wrapping up essentially the demise of Najib Sangar. And I think it's really important that you mentioned, like a lot of these speeches, Najib is making almost these sort of prophetic statements that this will happen and this may happen and this does happen, this and that did end up happening. But a lot of the people that are watching these speeches and are impressed don't actually realize that the reason Najib had these mystical powers of divination was because he put in motion he put in motion those very events by flooding Mujahideen commanders and foot soldiers and leaders with cash and with weapons. So, of course, when he done that, he did that in order to ensure division and infighting amongst the Mujahideen. So, of course, he would predict that the Mujahideen would end up fighting each other. Now we get to his legacy. Now, Dr. Najib is known as an Afghan nationalist and a Pashtun nationalist hero. And that is obviously because he is seen as having taken a very brave stance against Punjab. And that is quite literally what said, it's Punjab. But
Which is
I
racist.
think which is racist, but even if we if he were to be a Pashtun hero against Punjab, I would say he wouldn't preside over Dostum being deployed to if we're adopting a strictly ethnocentric perspective, Pashtun nationalists don't scud missile Pashtun villages, and they certainly don't send, if someone who loves Pashtuns does not send over Ghulam Jam Abdul Rashid Dostum to Arghandab and to Logar to fight against Hikmatyar and so on and so forth. And with regard to being an Afghan nationalist, whilst we have established that Najib definitely did he did have a change of heart. He did sort of wake up, have an epiphany, even had a religious awakening, like you said. And this is another thing that's important for people to realize, that practicing religious people, very religious people, are capable of mass cruelty, right? Najib maybe Najib had his awakening later on, but people like Professor Rabbani and Engineer Saib Hikmatyar, who are incredibly destructive personalities for Afghanistan. Hikmatyar used to pray tahajjud and fast once or twice a week, right? So a lot of the times we get sucked into this simplistic thinking that people who are very observant in their religious practice are not capable of evil. No, they are. But if we're talking about, if we're moving beyond perceptions of Najib, and in terms of the actual legacy, the empirical material legacy he left for Afghans, and once again, these are not opinions. These are facts. An opinion would be saying, yeah, well, he didn't have any choice, he had to do that, and that's a fair point. Okay, that's a fair point. but we're dealing with the realities on the ground as we saw them transpire. Najib's legacy in the real term, in the real world, was an empowerment of militias that he knew were very brutal and predatory. It was a complete and total disintegration of the state due to those militias, right? And him clinging on to power until it was far too late, rather than trying to usher in a political process, led to untold suffering for Afghans, because the chaotic manner in which his government collapsed also inadvertently, or rather advertently, played into the next episode of brutality that we saw on the streets of Kabul. And finally, his legacy as the Director General of Khad is one of industrial scale torture. Um, Industrial scale torture. Thousands, tens of thousands of Afghans disappeared. And yeah, so I understand that that may not be a lot of people, like I said, were in the live chat and they were very upset that we were pointing out the facts of his time in the secret police, and they were saying he tortured terrorists and not normal civilians, and this is what terrorists deserve. Even terrorists, I would say, have
Human rights.
every even
They
every
also have
human.
human rights.
Exactly. Every human being is entitled to a certain level of dignity, even if they are terrorists. That may be an opinion that people don't like, but that is what it is. And it obviously was not just terrorists, because I have, for example, I have uncles, even my mother's cousins, who were medical students who were picked up by the secret police in the middle of the night, and they were never seen again, and they weren't involved in the Mujahideen. And I know when I speak to other Afghans as well, they have relatives as well to whom the same thing happened. And you can call my relatives who were medical students terrorists. That's entirely your prerogative, but that is a legacy that was left to us by communism, and Najib, as a major cog in the machine of communism, contributed to that. So I think we should wrap it up on that note, Sangar. Um, we've actually got a super chat. Wow. DS, €19 and 99 cents. Thank you for this in-depth analysis of Najib's era, for stating the gruesome nature of the torture and brutalities committed by him and the legacy he left behind. Thank you very much, DS. Another thing that I saw in the live chat were people saying, why don't you talk about what the terrorists did? Well, we have. I think even in this podcast, we've covered somewhat vaguely, because it's not the topic of discussion. We've covered vaguely Hikmatyar's atrocities, the assassinations. Someone said, why don't you discuss the Taliban? I would encourage you to go and see our live stream on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, in which we discussed the Taliban's military strategy and the role that the brutality played in that military strategy. If we're talking about the life and the legacy of Dr. Najib, other than talking about how the Taliban killed him, it's not really the point of discussion. If we're talking about Dawood Khan, I'm not going to talk about Amanullah Khan's things. The stuff is just, it's basic common sense. But in any case, like I said, we're not going to put things inside you in a dark chamber. So you're totally entitled to disagree and even slander us. That's fine. But
And
I think on that, yeah.
on that note, thank you all for tuning in and being with us during this live recording of a podcast where we talk about a historical figure in Afghanistan, a significant figure, a divisive, controversial figure, and still someone who is revered and loved by many.
Perhaps we'll do an article on it as well at one point.
Inshallah. Thank you all, and until the next episode, the next live stream, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Leave a review if you listen to this podcast wherever you find it. And if you like our work, if you support us, please consider becoming a patron. Visit our Patreon page. You can alternatively also make donations via PayPal. And we received a €100 or something more than €100 donation even before we went live today. So thank you very much for that generous donation. It's someone who has been pampering us in the last few weeks and months. I hope, may Allah bless that person. Thank you very much. And wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.